Hi everyone, it's my first video blog that I've done in quite some time, so I will try to keep it within that 3 to 7 minutes. It's a big topic, but I will do my best. So the dissertation proposal that I have is the effectiveness of the heavy tank battalions on the Eastern and Western Front from 1942 to 1945. And in order to really understand what the Germans were doing with their heavy tanks, the Tiger 1, the Tiger 2, you have to look at blitzkrieg and analyze what the concepts of blitzkrieg. I'm a lot like Dr. Citino in that perspective, is that I hate the term blitzkrieg. It wasn't German. I refer to it as bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare. As a former armor infantry, heavy infantry guy myself, we were all about some maneuver warfare. But if we really want to understand blitzkrieg and what the Germans were planning to do with the heavy tanks, we have to understand the armor doctrine. So to Guderian, the Germans were going to use the heavy tanks to break through defenses, to destroy tanks, to destroy anti-tank guns. And that allowed the light tanks and the medium tanks to go through, maneuver to effect, as we saw them do in Poland and France and Russia for the first part of the war. So there have been more than a substantial amount of books written about blitzkrieg. If we go all the way back to Panzerleader, there was Panzerleader. One of the best I believe that I've ever read is one by Matthew Cooper called The German Army, Its Political and Military Failure, 1933 to 1945. Of course, Mary Haybeck wrote one called Storm of Steel. I believe it was her master's thesis, and it cites more archival data than any one thesis that I've ever read before. Some others, The Roots of Blitzkrieg by James Coram. He really goes in farther in depth than what Haybeck or Cooper do, in that he explores where Hans von Seeckt got his ideas from von Moltke, who of course was a student of Clausewitz. And some of the later ones, Lloyd Clark's Blitzkrieg, John Mosier's The Blitzkrieg Myth, expound on the ideas of what blitzkrieg was and was not. But the ones that we really should be focused on if we're going to do a serious study of blitzkrieg are, of course, Guderian being the primary source, Matthew Cooper, who used significant archival data, and Mary Haybeck, because they really break out what blitzkrieg was, what it was meant to be, and what it wasn't. What I think is telling is, of all the primary sources that are out there, Albert Kesselring's Combat Operations Manual says one word about tanks in the defensive, or literally one sentence rather, about tanks in the defensive. Tanks should not be utilized in the defensive unless there is no other option. So that takes us back to the Tigers. From the historiographical standpoint, the Tiger has really been a little bit overrepresented while also being underrepresented. I say it's been overrepresented because everyone knows what a Tiger looks like. When you see this tank, you recognize this is something it's German, it's Teutonic, it looks substantial. And you place it against any modern main battle tank, and it looks like it could hold its own. We know that not to be true, but so when this tank was conceived was after the Germans had encountered tanks that the Panzer III and Panzer IV could not face. They had talked about heavy tanks since at least 1935. They'd had designs since 1937 in the Rückfragen, but they never implemented any of those plans until it was a reactive R&D situation. And there's been, again, like Blitzkrieg, there's been a substantial amount of literature written about the Tiger, but there's never been, and even just not scholarly, so you'll have to forgive me on this, but just a quick glance at Wikipedia to look up the schwere Abteilung 501 through 511, and then the four heavy tank battalions that were attached to the SS. There are very few books that have been written about how they accomplished the missions that they were set out to do. When these tanks were, from the Clausewitzian perspective, the Germans loved their cult of the offensive. Well, these tanks didn't get to work in the offensive other than a few very, very small operations. And I say small from a relatively objective perspective. We're talking about the offensive at Kursk and the offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. So not small, but as over the course of the war, they only operated offensively a very few times. Um, these tanks have had very few analyses written about. I mean, I've found one an analysis written about how effective these tanks were in the defensive, and it was only on the Eastern Front. And it was written by Major Christopher Wilbeck, who was working for his master's thesis at the Army War College, and it didn't take into account uh, the Clausewitzian perspective of why the Tiger was culturally important to the Germans, what its role was supposed to be. It was looking purely at mission accomplishment and kill loss ratio. And from the perspective of combat histories of the Tiger, out of a disputed number, some say 14, some say 15. My research shows me that there are 15. There were 11 for the Wehrmacht. There were 4 for the SS. There are only 5 published combat histories that are primary sources. I mean, these were books that were written by tank crews of the Tiger. One of these is one of the better ones was written by Dr. Franz Wilhelm Lochmann, Richard Freiherr von Rosen, and Alfred Rubel. All 3 of these men were SS crews, one of which won the Knight's Cross for his work in Kursk. Another one, of course, we have Otto Carius's Tigers in the Mud. We all know the story of Otto Carius if we are a World War II aficionado. Some of the more famous ones, like Franz Stediger, one Tiger versus the 10th Russian Tank Corps, killed 20 tanks, scattered another 50. We recognize these things, but there are no real combat histories about these 15 units, 15 battalions that were organized into the heavy tank usage. And that's what my dissertation is hoping to do, is fill not just an academic gap, but I believe it is one of the largest academic gaps that still remains for World War II. I mean, something that is approaching 80 years, 80 years since its completion. My hope is that I'll be able to both fill that gap, but also fill that gap from an academic perspective where other people can build and expand on that work. To that end, my wife and I are planning on traveling to the Boddington Tank Museum to get to get into the British archives, to dig into the British perspective on this. We're planning on visiting Munich and Dresden so we can visit the German War Museum and the German Tank Museum. I also have been granted access to the Bundesarchive, so we can see and have digitized copies of Wehrmacht and SS records that are in existence. The biggest obstacle I found as of late is that the Soviet Union records, of course, now the Russians, the Russian Defense Ministry has placed a moratorium on foreign access for all military records. And from what I've read, they have found that it's believed they are trying to distance themselves from having collaborated with Nazi Germany, particularly the war against Poland, for which, as we know, they were not tried in the tribunal as Germans were for waging aggressive war because, well, they helped us win. So that's an obstacle. I may actually, as part of this grand European tour, have to make my way toward Kursk and to Moscow to visit the archives in person rather than accessing digitized copies. Additional resources that I'm going to be able to find, which I will have access to as a veteran, are the records at the War College, the records in the National Archives. I've been given access to some of their more private sections of that they don't generally digitize. They volunteered to digitize those for me. So the traveling will be extensive. We fortunately are able to, as a retiree who also still holds employment, we're fortunate that we're able to afford those trips to pursue my dissertation. So I appreciate you guys for listening to this. I know I went over just a little bit, but it is a very large topic, and anyone that's really dug into the topic before knows that while we hear about the tiger and the tiger II all the time, they're mythological as far as the psychological impact on the British and the Americans in North Africa. Not many people have written about how well they were operating, especially in the defensive role that they were not intended to serve in. So again, thanks a lot for listening, and I hope you guys have as much luck as I have so far. Thank you.